When I was a student at Reading University doing my horticulture degree back in the early 70s, we all had our trial plots where we grew vegetables and did experiments with them. And I had a big patch of couch grass in the corner of mine. And Mr. Barnwell, our tutor, said, "I'll get you some glyphosate, Bunny, and you can spray that off and we'll soon get rid of that." I resisted and I said, no, I'm going to keep pulling it out by hand, and by the end of the year it'll be exhausted and all gone. Anyway, Mr. Barnwell was very definitely right. Despite my best efforts, it was still pushing up the couch by the end of the year. Ever since then, I've heeded his advice, and I have used glyphosate to apply to perennial weeds in difficult places where I really need to get rid of them. And I find it works very effectively and very efficiently, far more than all the different methods which I've tried. I'm aware that using glyphosate is highly contentious, and so I've done quite a bit of research into why people say it should be banned. And I've come to the conclusion that as long as you use it wisely and safely at the concentrations they advocate, then I think it is perfectly safe. When glyphosate touches the soil, it binds very quickly with the clay particles within the soil, and so it actually becomes inactivated. Then it breaks down in a few months rather than years into a compound called AMPA, or amino methyl phosphonic acid. And this then breaks down into quite naturally occurring subjects like phosphates and carbon dioxide. So it is relatively harmless. It is, in fact, far safer than many household products that we use. And I think because of that, it does make sense to use it to solve your problem of perennial weeds. And I really don't think you can get rid of them in any other way nearly as efficiently. Bearing in mind that in America, they aerial spray crops of wheat to desiccate it prior to harvest. So that really is, to my mind, quite a non-targeted approach. And the amount used in agriculture over the many millions of acres of crops compared to what we use in our gardens to target very small amounts of perennial weeds is really no comparison whatsoever. Lots of research has been done on the possible cancer risks of glyphosate. In the USA, the EPA, the Environment Protection Agency, and other agencies in the EU, Japan, Asia, Australia have all done lots of research on it, and they've all come to the conclusion that glyphosate does not induce cancer. Some manufacturers put in a much more instant acting herbicide in with the glyphosate because they know that the public, when they apply something, like to see the results nowadays quickly. And so for good measure, they mix two chemicals in. But I think this is purely cosmetic. I like to see the glyphosate do the real job in hand, going right back down to the root. So I don't bother with the two chemicals, I just use the glyphosate. I have inadvertently introduced perennial weeds into my borders, and this is by the use of farmyard manure. People say use well broken down farmyard manure, but in my experience it often contains seeds or bits of rhizomes of many pernicious perennial weeds such as bindweed, ground elder, all the sort of things that we just dread. So I advocate never putting farmyard manure onto borders. I just think it's a risk that is too much to take. And also, if you have got a perennial weed problem, the very worst thing in the world would be to go and rotivate it, or to dig it, or cultivate it in any way, because then you're going to get the rhizomes, you're going to chop them up into tiny little pieces. Each little piece will produce a new plant. So in effect, you're making a nursery for perennial weeds. So just don't dig if you've got the perennial weeds. I'll use a small amount of glyphosate and just target spray those weeds. And that way it will kill them quickly and safely. And then I won't be bothered with them. Sometimes I might use 1 or 2 applications, but generally it is very, very effective. People are always tempted when they see a spray and they say dilute it at a certain rate. They always say, well, I'll just tip a bit more in the bottle for good measure. That is really bad. You want to apply it at the rate for your type of weed. So you have one rate for the easy perennial weeds like the couch and things like that. And don't be tempted to put on a stronger dose. And you'll find that commercial doses or retail packs with doses, they all will generally tell you to dilute to the same rate of active ingredient per litre. And it is important to do that. If you may increase the dose, what happens is the plant will die quicker, maybe in a few days as opposed to 2 or 3 weeks, but it doesn't go right back to the roots, which is what you want to do. You want to go right back to the roots and actually kill the roots. If you do a higher dose, it will kill the leaves and it won't travel back. So that's a very important thing to remember. So a good time to spray is generally when they're growing vigorously, and normally that's in spring when anything bursts into life. Another great time is in the autumn when they're starting to die down. So when it looks like it's starting to senesce, the weedy plant, you spray it and it takes that spray right back down into the roots. When I'm working within a border, I tend to cut the bindweed or the ground elder back to a bit. I let it grow back again, and then when it's about that high and easy to target, I carefully, very carefully with a little spray bottle, just spray it off. And if I inadvertently touch leaves of plants that I want to keep, precious plants that I love, then I'll actually pull those leaves off the plants that I've sprayed them so that the chemical doesn't go back down to their roots. And sometimes I actually take the plants, the weeds, in a carrier bag when they're still attached to their roots, so I can actually use the carrier bag to shield the spray from the plants that I want to keep, and then I tie them up in the bag and leave them for a few weeks till it takes the chemical right back down to their roots. And you come back and they're all floppy and dead, and the plants around them are nice and healthy. Now, many people advocate all sorts of different ways for killing perennial weeds. Some people say use a fabric. You can use something like Mypex, which they use in the nursery trade. You can use something called Plantex. There are many, many different types of fabrics, and you can put them over the ground, and you can either leave them like that so that no light comes in and nothing comes through, and then later on you remove the fabric and hopefully it's all died off. But many times I find, and this takes years of course, that actually rhizomes creep in from around the edge of the area, maybe at the footing of a wall or something like that, and they come down. And also they are very deep in the ground and they slowly work their way back up to the top again. So I generally don't find that very effective. You can put the membrane down, cut cross-shaped slips in it, pit plant in the slits and then put the fabric back and then cover it with a mulch. But again, I find that the weeds come up through the cross-shaped slits and they come through if you've got lots of perennial weeds there. Other people advocate mowing an area, sowing it to grass and mowing it repeatedly, and that way the perennial weeds cannot compete with the grass and the mowing. But then when you come to remove the turf, you can find, even after several years, the perennial weeds will come back. So I don't really find that effective, and it does take a long time. You've effectively removed that bed from your use for some years. You can sterilise the soil, of course. You can either sterilise it with a chemical that kills all the bugs, all the microorganisms, all the earthworms, and that will kill the perennial weeds for sure, but it also kills all the soil, and I don't think that's very environmentally sound. I've also seen in one really well-known garden where they had a big bindweed problem and ground elder, so they dug out the whole borders using JCBs, or excavators to a depth of 600 mil, 2 foot, dug out all the soil, and then they replaced it with clean soil. But there were still some perennial weeds because, again, they were all in the borders, in the walls at the edge of the borders that surrounded the borders, and then they crept back in. So although they massively reduced it, they still did have a bit of a problem. And I would advocate that doing that much disturbance to the soil, is that really better than using a little squirt or two of glyphosate? In my meadow grass areas, I do have the odd nettle and dock coming through. So what I do is, on a day when we've had some rain and the soil is nice and moist, I just go on with a rubber glove or a glove and I just pull them out so they slide out nicely, root and all. And I think nettles do actually respond quite well to pulling, in that you can get rid of them quite quickly in my experience. And I quite like to do that way. And if I've just got annual nettles that have just germinated and aren't big clumps, they're very easy to pull out with a glove. I don't like using chemicals in my garden, and I do restrict them to a very few. And the only chemicals that I really use are the glyphosate for my perennial weeds, and also I use some Signum when I get signs of box blight. Now that is a chemical that's only available for use with people with their PA1 and PA6 qualification. But if you need more information on getting rid of box blight or box moth or topiary, have a look at my 3 YouTube videos on those. But generally, I keep my use of pesticides to a very minimum, and many of the pesticides I use are safe for organic use. And the amount of pesticides now developed for the organic market is growing and growing. So you really don't have to use many that aren't approved for organic use at all.